In 2019, if you made $100,000 a year in America, you were doing pretty damn well. You weren't rich, but you were comfortable. Secure. You could afford a house, raise a family, maybe take a vacation without checking your bank account first. Fast forward to 2026, and that same salary in cities like San Francisco or New York doesn't just feel tight. It qualifies you for low-income housing assistance. Let me say that again. A six-figure income now puts you in the same category as people who need government help to survive. This isn't a headline designed to shock you. This is policy. This is mathematics. This is the new American reality, and if you think it's just a California problem or a New York problem, you're not paying attention. Because what happened to the $100,000 earner is a perfect case study in how an entire economic system can shift beneath your feet while you're still playing by the old rules. It's about inflation, yes, but it's also about housing, about wage stagnation, about the widening gap between what things cost and what people earn. And most importantly, it's about how the middle class in America didn't just shrink, it got redefined. So how did we get here? How did a salary that once symbolized success become barely enough to get by? Let's go back to 1999. The median household income in the United States was around $54,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $99,000 today. So in theory, wages have kept pace. But here's the thing about inflation, it's an average, and averages lie. Because while wages crept up slowly, certain costs exploded. Housing didn't just increase, it detonated. In the year 2000, the median home price in America was about $165,000. Today it's over $400,000. That's not inflation, that's a systemic rupture. In San Francisco, the median home price in 2000 was around $470,000. Today it's nearly $1.4 million. In Manhattan, a one-bedroom apartment that cost $2,000 a month to rent in 2000 now averages over $4,000. And we're not talking about luxury penthouses. We're talking about basic, livable space. The math is simple but brutal. If your salary doubles, but your rent triples, you're losing. If your income stays relatively flat while housing quadruples, you're drowning. And that's exactly what happened to the American middle class over the past 2 decades. But housing is just the beginning. Childcare costs have increased by over 60% since 2000. Healthcare premiums have risen by over 200%. College tuition has more than doubled. And none of these are discretionary expenses. These are the basic costs of participating in modern American life. So when people hear that $100,000 is now considered low income, they think it's absurd. They think it's coastal elites complaining about not being able to afford their third vacation home. But the data tells a different story. In San Francisco, the Department of Housing and Urban Development officially classified a family of 4 earning up to $104,000 as low income in 2024. By 2026, the threshold has only increased. This isn't some arbitrary number pulled from thin air. It's calculated based on the area median income, or AMI. And when housing costs in a region are so astronomically high that even people making 6 figures can't afford market rate rent, the government has to acknowledge reality. Because here's what low income actually means in policy terms. It means you qualify for affordable housing programs. It means the government has looked at your income relative to your cost of living and determined that without assistance, you are at risk of housing instability. Let that sink in. 6 figures, and you're at risk. This wasn't supposed to happen. The American economic model was built on a promise. Work hard, get educated, climb the ladder, and you'll be rewarded with stability. For decades, that promise held. A college degree was a ticket to the middle class. A good job meant a good life. But somewhere between the dot-com boom and the gig economy, the math stopped adding up. Wages stagnated while productivity soared. Corporate profits hit record highs while worker compensation flatlined. The cost of entry into the middle class, homeownership, education, healthcare, skyrocketed while the salary needed to afford it barely budged. And the people who played by the rules, who got the degree, who took the good job, found themselves running faster just to stay in place. But to understand how $100,000 became the new poverty line in America's most expensive cities, we need to look at the hidden forces that made it inevitable. The housing crisis didn't happen by accident. It was engineered piece by piece, through decades of policy decisions that prioritized investment returns over livability. And once you understand the mechanics, you realize that $100,000 being considered low income isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. Let's start with supply and demand. Basic economics, right? When demand exceeds supply, prices rise. But in America's most expensive cities, supply hasn't just failed to keep up with demand. It's been deliberately restricted. Take San Francisco. Between 2010 and 2020, the city added over 300,000 new jobs. How many new housing units did it build? Roughly 80,000. That's a ratio of nearly 4 jobs for every 1 new home. You don't need an economics degree to understand what happens next. You need 400 people competing for 100 apartments, and landlords can name their price. But why didn't developers just build more housing? Because they couldn't. Zoning laws, environmental reviews, neighborhood opposition, what urban planners call NIMBYism, not in my backyard, created a regulatory gauntlet so complex that even when developers wanted to build, it could take 5 to 10 years just to get approval. And every year of delay meant higher interest costs, higher construction costs, and ultimately, higher prices for the units that did get built. This wasn't just a San Francisco problem. New York, Los Angeles, Boston, Seattle, every high-cost city in America followed the same pattern. Restrictive zoning prevented density, lengthy approval processes killed projects, and existing homeowners, who saw their property values skyrocket, had every incentive to block new construction that might slow their gains. So supply stayed artificially constrained while demand surged. And prices did what prices always do in that scenario. They exploded. But here's where it gets darker. As housing became unaffordable for the middle class, it became irresistible to investors. Real estate in these cities wasn't just a place to live anymore. It was an asset class. Hedge funds, private equity firms, foreign investors, they started buying up properties not to occupy them, but to extract returns. In some neighborhoods, vacancy rates climbed even as rents soared because empty apartments were worth more as speculative holdings than as homes. By 2020, nearly 1 in 5 homes purchased in major American cities was bought by an investor, not a person looking for a place to live. And those investors could outbid any individual buyer because they had access to cheap capital and could afford to wait for appreciation. The market wasn't serving people anymore. It was serving portfolios. Meanwhile, wages weren't keeping pace. Between 2000 and 2020, the median wage in the United States increased by about 68%. Sounds decent until you realize that in that same period, housing costs in major cities increased by 150 to 300%. The gap wasn't just growing, it was becoming a chasm. And this is where the $100,000 earner gets trapped. Because that salary, which looks impressive on paper, gets shredded by the brutal arithmetic of urban living in 2026. Let's do the math. A person making $100,000 a year in San Francisco takes home roughly $68,000 after federal and state taxes. That's about $5,600 a month. Now, the average 1-bedroom apartment in San Francisco rents for $300 a month. That's 59% of take-home income, gone, just for a roof. Financial advisors recommend spending no more than 30% of your income on housing. This person is spending double that. And we haven't even gotten to food, transportation, healthcare, student loans, childcare, or any form of savings. Let's keep going. Health insurance premiums, even with employer contributions, average around $400 a month. Groceries in an expensive city, around $600 for one person. Transportation, whether it's a car payment, insurance and gas, or public transit, another $400. Student loan payments for the average borrower, $350. We're at $5,050. This person has $550 left for everything else. Savings, emergency fund, retirement, entertainment, anything unexpected, a medical bill, a car repair, and they're in the red. And this is for a single person. Add a spouse who also makes $100,000, and you're at $200,000 household income, which sounds wealthy. But now add a child. Childcare in San Francisco averages $2,000 a month per child. Add another child, and you're spending $4,000 a month on daycare alone. That's $48,000 a year, after tax, just to have someone watch your kids while you work. Suddenly, $200,000 a year doesn't feel like wealth. It feels like survival with better furniture. This is why the government had to create a new classification. Because people making six figures were showing up to affordable housing lotteries. They were applying for assistance programs. They were being priced out of the cities where they worked, forced into 2-hour commutes, or out of the region entirely. But here's the most insidious part. This isn't just about expensive cities anymore. The pressure is spreading. Austin, Texas, saw rents increase by 40% between 2020 and 2023. Boise, Idaho, once considered affordable, saw home prices double in the same period. Nashville, Phoenix, Denver, cities that were supposed to be the escape valves for people fleeing high-cost areas, they absorbed the influx and their prices exploded too. Remote work during the pandemic accelerated this. People thought they could keep their San Francisco salaries and move to cheaper cities. And they did. But they brought their buying power with them, and local residents who were making local wages couldn't compete. The affordability crisis metastasized, and wages still didn't keep up, because employers knew they didn't have to. For every person who demanded a raise or quit, there were 10 more willing to take the job. The leverage shifted entirely to capital, away from labor. And the people caught in the middle, the ones making what used to be good money, found themselves in a category that didn't even exist a generation ago. The high-earning poor. They're not starving, they're not homeless, but they're one medical emergency, one layoff, one broken transmission away from financial catastrophe. They have no savings, no safety net, no margin for error. And the stress of that precarity is invisible to everyone who looks at their salary and assumes they're doing fine. But the real consequences of this shift go far beyond individual bank accounts. Because when 6 figures isn't enough, the entire social contract starts to fracture. When a society reaches the point where $100,000 is considered low income, something fundamental breaks, not just economically, but psychologically, socially, politically. Because the implicit deal that held America together for generations, work hard, play by the rules, and you'll be okay, that deal is now void. And people know it. They feel it in every paycheck that doesn't stretch as far as it should. They see it when they run the numbers on buying a home and realize it's mathematically impossible. They experience it when they're told they're doing well, that they're in the top 20% of earners, and yet they still can't afford the life their parents had on half the income. This creates a rage that's hard to articulate, because on paper, you're successful. You have the degree, the job, the salary, but in practice you're struggling. And when you express frustration, you're met with eye rolls. 6 figures and you're complaining. But the numbers don't lie. When the median home price is 7 to 10 times your annual salary, when rent consumes 60% of your income, when childcare costs more than college tuition used to, the salary becomes irrelevant. It's the ratio that matters. And the ratios are broken. The aftermath of this is already visible. Birth rates in expensive cities are plummeting. Not because people don't want children, but because they can't afford them. The average age of first-time homebuyers has climbed from 31 to 36 in just 2 decades. An entire generation is delaying or abandoning the milestones that defined adulthood for their parents. Marriage, kids, home ownership, retirement savings, all of it pushed further into an uncertain future or abandoned entirely. And the social mobility that America prided itself on, it's calcifying. Because when the cost of entry into the middle class becomes insurmountable, class becomes hereditary. If your parents own a home in a good school district, you inherit access to quality education and a down payment for your own home. If they don't, you start miles behind and the gap only widens. Meritocracy becomes mythology. The political consequences are just as severe. When people feel economically abandoned, they become susceptible to extremes. They stop believing in incremental reform because incremental reform hasn't worked. They stop trusting institutions because institutions failed them. The center cannot hold when the center is hollowed out. We're already seeing it. Elections increasingly hinge on economic anxiety. Populist movements, left and right, are fueled by the same core grievance. The system is rigged, and the people who played by the rules got screwed. That's not paranoia. That's pattern recognition. So what happens next? There are a few possible futures, and none of them are pleasant unless something changes dramatically. Scenario 1. The status quo continues. Housing costs keep rising faster than wages. More cities cross the threshold where 6 figures qualifies as low income. The professional class continues to hollow out, split between the genuinely wealthy who own assets and the high-earning poor who rent their lives month to month. Social mobility freezes entirely. Class becomes destiny. America becomes a nation of landlords and tenants, owners and renters, capital and labor, with no middle ground. Scenario 2. Policy intervention. Governments finally forced the issue. Aggressive zoning reform, massive public housing investment, rent control, vacancy taxes, restrictions on investor purchases. It's politically difficult because every policy that lowers housing costs is a policy that destroys homeowner wealth. And homeowners vote. But if the alternative is social collapse, maybe the math changes. Maybe politicians decide that a controlled decline in property values is better than an uncontrolled unraveling of society. Scenario 3. Migration and abandonment. People vote with their feet, not just to cheaper cities, because those are disappearing, but out of expensive regions entirely. Companies follow the talent. Major cities depopulate. This has already started. San Francisco lost over 60,000 residents between 2020 and 2023. New York saw similar outflows. If that accelerates, you get a negative feedback loop. Tax base shrinks, services decline. Quality of life deteriorates, more people leave. Detroit, but with tech campuses. Scenario 4, and this is the darkest one. Nothing changes until crisis forces it. Economic crashes, mass defaults, social unrest. History suggests that systems this broken don't reform themselves peacefully. They break. And what comes after depends on who's holding the pieces. But here's what we know for certain. The designation of $100,000 as low income isn't an anomaly. It's a warning sign. It's the system telling us loudly that something is fundamentally wrong with how we've structured our economy. And ignoring it, dismissing it as coastal elitism or entitlement, is a failure of imagination. Because if you think this only affects people in San Francisco or Manhattan, you're not looking ahead. The dynamics that created this problem, restrictive housing policy, wage stagnation, the financialization of real estate, investor dominance, these are spreading. What's happening in the most expensive cities today is coming to second-tier cities tomorrow. And the longer we wait to address it, the harder the correction will be. The $100,000 earner isn't complaining about not being rich. They're complaining about not being stable, about working full-time, following the rules, earning what society told them was a good salary, and still living paycheck to paycheck. About being one bad month away from crisis. That's not entitlement, that's alarm. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Salary numbers are meaningless without context. $100,000 in rural Kansas is wealth. $100,000 in San Francisco is survival. What matters is purchasing power. What matters is the ratio between what you earn and what life costs. And in America's most expensive cities, that ratio has become obscene. So when we talk about a six-figure salary being low income, we're not exaggerating for clicks. We're documenting the collapse of a promise. The promise that hard work leads to security. The promise that education leads to prosperity. The promise that the next generation will have it better than the last. That promise is dying. And unless something changes, unless we confront the structural forces that made $100,000 insufficient, it won't just die in San Francisco and New York. It'll die everywhere. Because once the math breaks in the most expensive markets, it spreads. The investors move to the next city. The remote workers drive up prices in the next region. The affordability crisis is a contagion, and it's only a matter of time before it reaches every corner of the country that people actually want to live in. The question isn't whether this is sustainable. It's clearly not. The question is what breaks first. The housing market, the political system, the social fabric, or our willingness to pretend that everything is fine. In 2026, $100,000 is low income, not because the salary shrank, but because the cost of living exploded while we looked the other way. And if that doesn't terrify you, you're not paying attention. Because what happened to the $100,000 earner can happen to anyone. The floor keeps falling. And one day, you might look down and realize there's nothing left beneath you.